you've taken the time to read the Old Testament, that the Hebrew laws in regards to slavery fundamentally and totally different than what you have under Roman law, and even further removed from what you had in the pre-Civil War South in the United States. That slavery very frequently was the last ditch. It might even be called a safety net, a societal safety net. You could no longer bring in food. Starvation was a real possibility. The last thing of value you had was yourself. And you could, by selling yourself into slavery, provide even for your family. Certainly, it meant a diminishment in your own personal freedom, but it would mean that you would be alive the next day. And so, in this situation, you have a man who lies carnally with a woman who is a slave acquired for another man, but who has in no way been redeemed nor given her freedom. So, in other words, this is not the same situation we see elsewhere in the law, where you have two people, they're in the city. Therefore, if she did not want to engage in this activity, if she cried out, there would be other people who would hear, etc., etc. The law, interestingly enough, took into account a lot of that kind of situation as we look at both Leviticus and Deuteronomy together. But she does not have her freedom. And yet it's still identified as a sin. However, it says, there shall be punishment. They shall not, however, be put to death because she was not free. Now, it's very interesting that you have here a insistence that we look at the position in which the individuals were involved and the power structures that were involved in this situation. And the man is the one who is to bring a guilt offering to Yahweh, the doorway of the tent, a ram for a guilt offering. That was not a small punishment, unless the person happened to be extremely wealthy, I suppose. But there was a need for a ram for a guilt offering beyond what you would have on the Day of Atonements. So when this was found out, whenever that would be, this guilt offering would need to be made. And the priest would make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before Yahweh for his sin which he has committed, and the sin which he has committed will be forgiven him. And so there is we can, I think, see the importance of the fact that the law is not just simply a black and white, if this happens, do this situation. It recognizes even that its own strictures set up situations where it would be inappropriate for the ultimate penalty to be brought here. And in fact, even the opportunity for forgiveness is provided through the sacrificial system. And so there is a recognition that there are levels of guilt. There are levels of accountability. And when the woman was not free, then she cannot be put to death. And even, I think, probably because of the fact that this seemingly would indicate some kind of situation where the woman was in this person's home, or at least in this person's circle of people that he would be around very regularly, a recognition of the necessity of providing a means for forgiveness here. So what we can see, I think, in these few verses together is that the law recognizes the need for looking at the circumstances, which, by the way, just briefly also indicates, I think this is very, very important, one of the elements that must be kept in mind in looking especially at the punishments in the Old Testament law is that the assumption is that we're dealing with godly judges. The assumption of the application of God's law is that you have priests, you have judges, and that they are functioning under the law of God. This, to me, is one of the most important issues in regards to looking at God's law, various movements that exist today in regards to God's law, and the discussion of the application of God's law. The assumption is that there is a culture here, there is a land here, there is a people here who are covenanted with God, and hence you have just judges. Any system of government, I don't care what the system of government is, that has judges in it, if those judges become unjust, that system will be overthrown. And we we are seeing that around us, sadly, all the time. No system can possibly survive with unjust judgment. And there is simple, necessary need for righteous judges, for there to be righteousness in any land. And I believe it is a blessing upon a land to have just judges. Therefore, it is judgment upon the land when judges just judge unjustly. No question about that whatsoever. Now then you have, in verses 23 through 25, you have a discussion of the fruit of the trees. And again, people have speculated that when you plant new fruit trees, you know that it takes a while for them, normally, not always, but normally takes a while for them to produce good fruit. And obviously it depends on the kind of fruit tree and so on and so forth. But there's people have said, well, generally for the first few years it's not really all that good anyways, and so on and so forth. Okay, maybe so. I'm not saying that I can say, no, that has nothing to do with it. But what it does, what I seem to see here is, especially verse 24, but in the fourth year all its fruit should be holy, an offering of praise to Yahweh. Now, let's say the first 3 years, the fruit wasn't all that great anyways, and so the disposing of it wasn't a big deal. And then let's say the fourth year the fruit's great. It's wonderful. What do you clearly see here? But a call for the people of Israel not only to recognize that the increase of their flocks, the increase of their crops, the increase of their fruit, all comes from God's hand. It's all His. In so much of what we have here, there is a restraint upon the greed of man. There is a restraint upon the greed of man. It is not until the fifth year you are to eat its fruit, and its yield may increase for you. So after 5 years, I mean, that's an investment. You've got to have trust that God's still going to be taking care of you 5 years down the road to be able to take the position that the person of God is being called to take here. And you have to trust that God's going to care for you, and God's going to make provision for you and provide for you and your family, even on that fourth year when, oh, that fruit is so good. And you happened, of course, to have picked to raise the very kind of fruit that you love so much. But still, if you want to have that fruit, you don't get to take it off your own tree. You got to go buy it from one of your neighbors who got started before you. They're in their fifth year now.